obstruction of justice is. And so they may not go after him legally, but they may decide that they want to pursue the president politically because they believe that there is enough evidence that he tried to obstruct this investigation. And Republicans say, of course, Democrats are going to do that because they're looking for anything to pin on the president. So that's the sort of the, that gives you a sense of the political drama that is taking place here on Capitol Hill alongside the legal drama.
You know what, that's a really great point, Nancy, that while this is a legal document, it's also sort of a political document, and there have been many sort of investigations that have spun out from this, though it started with whether or not and to what degree Russia Russia interfered with the 2016 election. But clearly there are all sorts of other issues, and there may be pertinent information in this report that will lead to further questioning in Congress for a rainbow of investigations.
Right.
I know that.
And can I make one other point also?
Please.
You're asking about the fact that Robert Mueller was not involved in crafting this 4-page summary. He won't be with Attorney General Barr today. He wasn't necessarily invited to do any of those things. The Attorney General made it pretty clear that he wasn't going to seek Robert Mueller's input on this summary. He said he would. He offered to show it to Mueller, and Mueller declined to see it. But that's different than saying, I worked with the special counsel to make sure I got it just right. And that's probably the reason that Mueller said, well, if I'm not going to be involved in this document, if I don't have sign off on it, I don't really, there's no point in me seeing it afterwards just so you can show me something that you're then going to send to Capitol Hill. So there's no indication that Mueller, has sort of washed his hands of this and walked away, but he just, chose not to be shown the document that he was not going to be able to have any input on. And we have every reason to believe that if he is asked to come up to Capitol Hill to sort of to discuss his team's findings himself in person, that he will probably do it.
Nancy, thank you. Weijia Jiang, thank you. Let's turn to the legal aspect. Ricky Kleeman and Rebecca Roythe are now joining us. Ricky's a CBS News legal analyst. Rebecca is a CBSN legal contributor and former assistant district attorney for New York County. Ricky, I'd like to start with you. You wrote the book on grand jury testimony, and one of the things that the Attorney General has said is, I need to redact some things that protect grand jury testimony. Why is that important?
Grand jury testimony under Rule 6e is what we call sacred testimony. It is not allowed to be disclosed by the federal rules of criminal procedure, and there is good reason for that. People should be able to testify before a grand jury and not fear reprisal. That's why their names are kept secret, their testimony is kept secret, and no one who is supposed to give out that information, not the grand jurors, and definitely not the prosecutors. So you can't just willy-nilly decide to go around Rule 6e and give out grand jury testimony to the public. It's one of the things that has been a big misconception in the media coverage of the Barr redactions, because he is not at liberty to go forward without getting leave of a court in order to be able to give out 6e material. Now, while saying that, the witness themselves, the witness who is in the grand jury, if the witness decides they want to talk about their testimony, no one is stopping them. So some of these witnesses have, in fact, talked about their testimony. So then you become involved in a question of, well, whether or not there was a waiver. So my biggest curiosity when we get to the issue of obstruction of justice, which for me is the key in looking at the Mueller report, because no collusion is no collusion. Obstruction, where William Barr and Rod Rosenstein have come to a conclusion that there is not a crime here, I want to know how much material we're going to get to see. Congress is going to ask for all of it. A lot of people feel the American public should see all of it, but it's not that simple.
Another category for the redactions is ongoing investigations. And when I first heard that, I thought there's so many investigations that's got to fall in, that's got to be quite a large category.
It's a large category, and we know from a motion that was filed yesterday in the Roger Stone case that we are now dealing with the issue of other investigations. Because the Roger Stone case, we find suddenly in Judge Jackson's courtroom in the District of Columbia, winds up looking at the Mueller report, as well as Roger Stone's own case. So we know that Roger Stone has already been indicted, but apparently there may be other things coming from that. So yes, ongoing investigations are traditionally not given out for good reason.
Rebecca, let me ask you the bar. How high is the bar when it comes to determining whether or not a crime in this case was committed?
Well, it's high. I mean, it has to do with intent, and intent is hard to prove. I mean, prosecutors struggle all the time with proving intent, and you know, various different prosecutors are willing to go into the courtroom with various different amounts of evidence in order to prove intent. And anything like obstruction of justice or any white-collar crime involves some degree of intent, which is hard to prove. And so it is a really high bar, and that doesn't mean that it's the same bar that Congress has to use for impeachment purposes. They can use an entirely different standard. And so the question remains, what are the facts in this report? And I think that's what everybody is looking for, is facts and not necessarily legal conclusions, not spin, just plain facts. What did they conclude happened?
And so it's highly possible people could walk away thinking, man, this looks bad, but it didn't rise to that bar, Ricky.
Well, it didn't rise to that bar according to these prosecutors, including the special counsel, who did not come to a conclusion one way or the other. He's in a state of equipoise. He passes it off either to the Attorney General or to Congress. One really doesn't know what Robert Mueller's intent was. But then William Barr and Rod Rosenstein, we have to remember Rod Rosenstein is involved here, made the decision that it did not reach the level of criminal intent for obstruction of justice. One of the interesting things about this obstruction, if there is any, or the evidence about this obstruction, is that a lot of the president's activity was done in plain sight. It was done because he went on television. It was done because he tweeted. There's not too much that we don't know about the president's intent. We know what former FBI Director Comey said about the about the non-prosecution of Michael Flynn. And Comey says, when he testifies in front of Congress, well, he told me to go easy on the guy. He's a nice guy. Was it a direct order? No. Might I taken it as a direct order, even though it was kind of a passing of words? It's not quite a slip of the tongue. It's just a phrase. You know, he's a nice guy. Maybe you should go easy on him. But does the FBI director take that, as Michael Cohen said, a coded order? Well, look, if you've got to go into a court of law, you can't take someone's interpretation of code. You have to take what is real.
Rebecca, Ricky brought up something that has been hotly debated since we saw that 4-page summary, right? This idea that the AG determined that there was not enough evidence, based on reading Mueller's report, that there was not enough evidence to conclude obstruction of justice. But the debate is, was that really what Mueller was wanting him to do when he did not make a call on obstruction of justice? Or was the expectation that that would be then presented to Congress to determine?
You know, in a way, I don't think Mueller cared. I think he wanted to get the facts to the American people and to Congress to make this determination. He was aware of the DOJ policy that we don't indict a sitting president, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is what Congress thinks of this material and what the American people think about this material, and the criminal standard is almost beside the point. And it's like, people have been obsessed with this question, like the legal question. I mean, myself included. It's not, you know, it's not other people. It's just that doesn't really matter. So I think Mueller was just saying, look, we're going to stay out of this, which is in fact a political fight. In most criminal cases, it has nothing to do with politics, but here it is a political fight. And so what he was trying to do, which I think is, I mean, I don't know, what I speculate that he was trying to do is just try to keep himself away from the political fray in order to save the reputation of the Department of Justice and the FBI as a apolitical body, a law enforcement body that can be respected and trusted when they actually determine reality.
Hopefully we will get some clarity on that once we see the report.
Well, no, you're going to get some clarity on that once Robert Mueller testifies.
Well, that's
because we can't read Robert Mueller's mind.
But maybe in the report he said, I intend this to go to Congress.
That would be very wishful thinking, Anne-Marie. I hope you're right.
You know, it's interesting, Ricky, when you were talking about the things that the president says in broad daylight, right, where they don't seem to be a secret from behind this. scenes, I was just Googling what did he say about Russia, and this was the quote. He said, in broad daylight, "I will tell you this, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press." I think about if he said that behind the scenes, and we hadn't heard it, and it just came out in the Mueller report, we'd be like, whoa, that's a big deal.
Exactly. But there are lots of things that he has said publicly, especially during his campaign rallies. And then, I mean, when you look at the WikiLeaks, are you listening, WikiLeaks?
Right.
You know, come and help us out, give us those emails. But also what he has said on Twitter, that because it's the old, where is the defendant hiding? Where is the suspect hiding? And he's hiding in plain sight. So this is someone who, by virtue of his bursting everything out into the open, including his interview with Lester Holt about the Russia investigation and about the firing of Comey, where he says to Lester Holt that he fired him because of, quote unquote, that Russia thing. And that type of comment, exactly correct, David, if you said it in private, would clearly be a mountain of obstruction. But because you say it publicly, it takes away the secrecy. Obstruction of justice. Go ahead.
If you're his legal counsel, is that probably the most brilliant thing your client is doing? Because it's not happening behind the scene. He's saying it, and then something else is said 2 hours later, which is just as aghast.
But no legal counsel would have ever counseled him to do.
Not to do it, but if you have nothing else, I mean, the best excuse that I've heard so far is, well, he's just being innocent and honest, and he's being himself.
He's being Trump.
Right.
You know, Trump being Trump.
It's an excuse, but back to what you guys were saying about obstruction is you need to prove intent. And they didn't talk to the president. They didn't say, well, what did you mean by all these tweets? Were you just joking? Were you just being Trump?
It's a problem of having not spoken with him. There is no doubt about it. I think one of the other things that bothers a great many critics of the Mueller report, even before it has been released, is the question of, well, what happened to conversations with Jared? What happened to conversations with Donald Trump Jr.? Where is all of the evidence having to do with obstruction, having to do with dealing with the Trump Tower meeting, and then the alleged drafting of the excuse for Donald Trump Jr. on Air Force One as to why that meeting was held? That seems to have just gone into the wind. So I hope when I look at this, I'm going to be looking for that meeting. What happened to it?
With that meeting, do you subscribe to sort of the theory that if you're not one of the witnesses being questioned, then you may be the subject? Because we know that Hope Hicks, who helped to craft that statement, was questioned. We know Don McGahn was questioned. We know that Donald Trump Jr. was not.
Subjects are questioned. Targets may not be.
Okay, and if they're the last person. So, you know, if anything, they would be the last person to be
We know
questioned.
Jared Kushner was questioned.
Yeah.
He was in the room for that meeting.
So we've been given a 2-minute warning that the Attorney General will step to the podium shortly. Rebecca, as we continue briefly, what should we make of the fact that Mr. Mueller didn't compel the president to testify?
Again, I don't think this is a criminal prosecution. I don't think he ever intended it to be a criminal prosecution. Any good prosecutor in their right mind would have done that if it were a normal criminal prosecution. Since he knew this was never going to be in a court of law, how important was it? I mean, you know, now I don't think it's that important for Congress. I think we all know what President Trump would say in a circumstance like that. It's not critical. What's critical is to have all of this information out there. And I think more importantly, I'm looking at the report to try to figure out why. Okay, so if he wasn't obstructing justice, why? There are all these contacts from Russia, and the president is lying about it. And maybe it's just for political purposes, and then, you know, people can judge that for what they want. But it does seem a little strange. So I want to be able to figure out why. Why were so many people lying about what was actually going on?
Vicky, if you could ask Mueller one question, what would it be?
Why he didn't come to a conclusion on obstruction of justice. You have to remember that Mueller is a very different special counsel than when we saw Ken Starr in his role during Clinton.
Tell us why. That's
well,
important.
Ken Starr was out front with everything. Ken Starr was the leading prosecutor. Ken Starr assumed the role not only of investigator, but he really assumed the role that William Barr is assuming now. I mean, we saw Ken Starr all over the place, and Ken Starr's strong feelings about what was indeed a crime.
Can you imagine if Trump would have had Ken Starr and Ken Starr would have been at the podium every week? At least William Barr, at least Mueller said nothing.
Mueller believes in saying nothing. I have known him for many, many decades professionally, and he does not like to talk to the press. He believes he should do his job without interference from the press.
How do you think Mueller's going to sort of go down in history?
Silence on this side of the day.
I don't know. You know, I think he in all of this, people are being ripped apart by politics, and I think, at least for now, I mean, and again, we haven't seen the report, we don't know what's in there, but I think for now, most people still have faith that he did this in an actually apolitical way in which he was devoted to being impartial and finding the facts, and I think that's a good way to go down in history if you're within the FBI or within the Department of Justice.
As I recall, Preet Bharara, who had been the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York and had the distinction of being the one who would not resign and therefore was fired by Donald Trump, and is very clear about his beliefs about the president and this investigation. And he was asked on Twitter if he still thought that Robert Mueller was his hero after William Barr came out with his 4-page summary, and there was no finding of collusion and an ambiguous finding at best about obstruction. And Preet Bharara said that indeed Robert Mueller remained his hero.
What about the fallout when it comes to this report beyond, the report and, what Nadler does with it if he decides that it's impeachable or not, and all that conversation? There are other investigations going on. If this report comes out and, everyone gets a good look at it and obstruction of justice, absolutely no way. Collusion or cooperation, coordination, whatever the phrasing is, absolutely no way. Does this sort of take the steam out of all these other investigations? Oh, hold that thought. We are going to take you to the Justice Department. We're going to have a CBS News special report about to start any moment now. It looks like the Attorney General will be coming to the podium.
Yeah, it looks
shortly.
like we just got a 2-minute warning, but they delayed
Another
it.
2-minute warning?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
This is a CBS News special report, and this is the day for nearly 2 years that many Americans have been waiting for. I'm Norah O'Donnell with Gayle King and John Dickerson in New York. I want to take you now to Washington, where Attorney General William Barr is about to speak to reporters about the special counsel's report on Russian election interference.
Now, later this morning, Barr will release a redacted version of Robert Mueller's report, meaning that some of the material was removed as required by law. Barr said last month that Mueller's evidence does not support any criminal charges for obstruction of justice, but it also does not exonerate the president.
Paula Reed is at the Justice Department for that news conference and joins us on the phone. So, Paula, we heard this morning a number of different things the Attorney General might be talking about. One of them is executive privilege. What do you make of that?
That's right. Well, there have been some outstanding questions about whether or not the president would have tried to assert executive privilege over any materials in this redacted report. But here comes the Attorney General, so I'm going to hop off.
Okay. And now we see the Attorney General, William Barr, recently taken that position, joined by the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, as well.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here this morning. As you know, on March 22nd, Special Counsel Robert Mueller concluded his investigation into matters related to Russian attempts to interfere in our 2016 presidential election, and he submitted his confidential report to me pursuant to department regulations. As I said during my Senate confirmation hearing and since, I'm committed to ensuring the greatest degree possible of transparency concerning the special counsel's investigation, consistent with the law. At 11 this morning, I'm going to transmit copies of the public version of the special counsel's report to the chairman and ranking members of the Senate and House Judiciary Committees. The Department of Justice will also make the report available to the American people by posting it on the department's website after it has been delivered to Congress. I'd like to make a few comments today on the report. Before I do that, I want to thank Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein for joining me here today and for his assistance and counsel throughout this process. Rod, as you know, has served at the department for nearly 30 years with dedication and distinction, and it's been a great privilege and pleasure for me to work with him since my confirmation. He had well-deserved plans to step back from public service that were interrupted by my asking him to help in my transition. Rod has been an invaluable partner, and I am grateful that he is willing to help me and has been able to see the special counsel's investigation through to its conclusion. Thanks, Rod. Yeah. I'd also like to thank Special Counsel Robert Mueller for his service and the thoroughness of his investigation, particularly his work exposing the nature of Russia's attempts to interfere in our electoral process. As you know, one of the primary purposes of the Special Counsel's investigation was to determine whether President Trump's campaign or any individual associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election. Volume 1 of the Special Counsel's report describes the results of that investigation. As you will see, the Special Counsel's report states that his, quote, investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. I am sure that all Americans share my concern about the efforts of the Russian government to interfere in our presidential election. As the Special Counsel report makes clear, the Russian government sought to interfere in our election process. But thanks to the Special Counsel's thorough investigation, we now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign, or the knowing assistance of any other American for that matter. That is something that all Americans can and should be grateful to have confirmed. The Special Counsel report outlines two main efforts by the Russian government to influence the 2016 election. First, the report details efforts by the Internet Research Agency, a Russian company with close ties to the Russian government, to sow social discord among American voters through disinformation and social media operations. Following a thorough investigation of this disinformation campaign, the Special Counsel brought charges in federal court against several Russian nationals and entities for their respective roles in this scheme. Those charges remain pending, and the individual defendants remain at large. But the Special Counsel found no evidence that any American, including anyone associated with the Trump campaign, conspired or coordinated with the Russian government or the IRA in this illegal scheme. Indeed, as the report states, quote, the investigation did not identify evidence that any U.S. person knowingly or intentionally coordinated with the IRA's interference operation, unquote. Put another way, the Special Counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities. Second, the report details efforts by the Russian military officials associated with the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Organization, to hack into computers and steal documents and emails from individuals associated with the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton's campaign for the purpose of eventually publicizing these documents. Obtaining such unauthorized Following a thorough investigation of these hacking operations, the Special Counsel brought charges to court against several Russian military officers for their respective roles in these illegal hacking operations. Those charges are still pending, and the defendants remain at large. But again, the Special Counsel's report did not find any evidence that members of the Trump campaign or anyone associated with the campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these hacking operations. In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking. The special counsel's investigation also examined Russian efforts to publish stolen emails and documents on the internet. The special counsel found that after the GRU disseminated some of the stolen documents to entities that it controlled, DC Leaks and Guccifer 2, the GRU transferred some of the stolen materials to WikiLeaks for publication. WikiLeaks then made a series of document dumps. The special counsel also investigated whether any member or affiliate of the Trump campaign encouraged or otherwise played a role in these dissemination efforts. Under applicable law, publication of these types of material would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. Here, too, the special counsel's report did not find that any person associated with the Trump campaign illegally participated in the dissemination of the materials. Finally, the special counsel investigated a number of links or contacts between the Trump campaign officials and individuals connected with the Russian government during the 2016 presidential campaign. After reviewing these contacts, the special counsel did not find any conspiracy to violate U.S. law involving Russian-linked persons and any persons associated with the Trump campaign. So that's the bottom line. After nearly 2 years of investigation, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of warrants, and witness interviews, the special counsel confirmed that the Russian government sponsored efforts to illegally interfere with the 2016 presidential election, but did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts. After finding no underlying collusion with Russia, the special counsel's report goes on to consider whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction of the special counsel's investigation. As I addressed in my March 24th letter, the special counsel did not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment regarding this allegation. Instead, the report recounts 10 episodes involving the president and discusses potential legal theories for connecting those activities to the elements of an obstruction offense. After carefully reviewing the facts and legal theories outlined in the report, and in consultation with the Office of Legal Counsel and other department lawyers, the Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision. Instead, we accepted the special counsel's legal framework for purposes of our analysis and evaluated the evidence as presented by the special counsel in reaching our conclusions. In assessing the president's actions discussed in the report, it is important to bear in mind the context. President Trump faced an unprecedented situation. As he entered into office and sought to perform his responsibilities as president, federal agents and prosecutors were scrutinizing his conduct before and after taking office and the conduct of some of his associates. At the same time, there was relentless speculation in the news media about the president's personal culpability. Yet, as he said from the beginning, there was in fact no collusion. And as the special counsel's report acknowledges, there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by his sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by his political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks. Nonetheless, the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation, providing unfettered access to campaign and White House documents, directing senior aides to testify freely, and asserting no privilege claims. And at the same time, the president took no act that in fact deprived the special counsel of the documents and witnesses necessary to complete his investigation. Apart from whether the acts were obstructive, This evidence of non-corrupt motives weighs heavily against any allegation that the president had a corrupt intent to obstruct the investigation. Now, before I take questions, I want to address a few aspects of the process for producing the public report that I am releasing today. As I said several times, the report contains limited redactions related to 4 categories of information. To ensure as much transparency as possible, those redactions have been clearly labeled so that the readers can tell which redactions correspond to which categories. Now, as to recall, those categories are 6E material, grand jury material, information that the IC believes would disclose sources and methods, information that would impair the investigation and prosecution of other cases that are underway, and finally, information that implicates the privacy and reputational interests of peripheral third parties. As you will see, most of the redactions were compelled by the need to prevent harm to ongoing matters and to comply with court orders prohibiting the public disclosure of information bearing on ongoing investigations and criminal cases, such as the IRA case and the Roger Stone case. These redactions were applied by Department of Justice attorneys working closely together with attorneys from the Special Counsel's Office, as well as the intelligence community, and prosecutors are handling the ongoing cases. The redactions are their work product. No redactions done by anybody outside this group. There were no redactions done by anybody outside this group. No one outside this group proposed any redactions, and no one outside the department has seen the unredacted report, with the exception of certain sections that were made available to IC, the intelligence community, for their advice on protecting intelligence sources and methods. Consistent with long-standing executive branch practice, the decision whether to assert executive privilege over any portion of the report rested with the President of the United States. Because the White House had voluntarily cooperated with the special counsel, significant portions of the report contained material over which the President could have asserted privilege, and he would have been well within his rights to do so. Following my March 29th letter, the Office of the White House Counsel requested the opportunity to review the redacted version of the report in order to advise the President on the potential invocation of privilege, which is consistent with long-standing practice. Following that review, the President confirmed that in the interest of transparency and full disclosure to the American people, he would not assert privilege over the special counsel's report. Accordingly, the public report I am releasing today contains redactions only for the 4 categories that I previously outlined, and no material has been redacted based on executive privilege. In addition, earlier this week, the President's personal counsel requested and was given the opportunity to read a final version of the redacted report before it was publicly released. That request was consistent with the practice followed under the Ethics in Government Act, which permitted individuals named in a report prepared by an independent counsel the opportunity to read the report before publication. The President's personal lawyers were not permitted to make and did not request any redactions. In addition to making the redacted report public, we are also working with Congress to accommodate their legitimate oversight interests with respect to the special counsel's investigation. We have been consulting with Chairman Graham and Chairman Nadler through this process, and we will continue to do so. Given the limited nature of the redactions, I believe that the publicly released report will allow every American to understand the results of the special counsel's investigation. Nevertheless, in an effort to accommodate congressional requests, we will make available, subject to appropriate safeguards, to a bipartisan group of leaders from several congressional committees, a version of the report with all redactions removed, except those relating to grand jury information. Thus, these members of Congress will be able to see all of the redacted material for themselves, with the limited exception of that which by law cannot be shared. I believe that this accommodation, together with my upcoming testimony before the Senate and House Judiciary Committees, will satisfy any need Congress has for information regarding the special counsel's investigation. Once again, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I will now have a few questions.
Mr. Attorney General, we don't have the report in hand, so could you explain for us the special counsel's articulated reason for not reaching a decision on obstruction of justice, and if it had anything to do with the department's long-standing guidance on not indicting a sitting president? And you say you disagreed with some of his legal theories. What did you disagree with him on?
I leave it to his description in the report, the special counsel's own articulation of why he did not want to make a determination as to whether or not there was an obstruction offense. But I will say that when we met with him, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein and I met with him along with Ed O'Callaghan, who is the principal associate deputy. On March 5th, we specifically asked him about the OLC opinion and whether or not he was taking the position that he would have found a crime but for the existence of the OLC opinion. And he made it very clear several times that that was not his position. He was not saying that but for the OLC opinion he would have found a crime. He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
Did you disagree with him on?
May I follow up on that, Mr. Attorney General?
What did you disagree with him on?
Given that, why did you and Mr. Rosenstein feel the need you had to take it to the next step to conclude that there was no crime, especially given that DOJ policy?
Well, the very prosecutorial function and all our powers as prosecutors, including the power to convene grand juries and the compulsory process that's involved there, is for one purpose and one purpose only. It's determined yes or no. Was alleged conduct criminal or not criminal? That is our responsibility, and that's why we have the tools we have. And we don't go through this process just to collect information and throw it out to the public. We collect this information, we use that compulsory process for the purpose of making that decision. And because the special counsel did not make that decision, we felt the department had to, and that was a decision by me and the Deputy Attorney General.
Yes. Barr, did the special counsel indicate that he wanted you to make the decision or that it should be left for Congress? And also, how do you respond to criticism you're receiving from congressional Democrats that you're acting more as an attorney for the president rather than as the chief law enforcement officer?
Special Counsel Mueller did not indicate that his purpose was to leave the decision to Congress. I hope that was not his view, since we don't convene grand juries and conduct criminal investigations for that purpose. He did not, I didn't talk to him directly about the fact that we were making the decision, but I am told that his reaction to that was that it was my prerogative as Attorney General to make that decision.
Attorney General Bob Kaufman, Fox News. Hi there. Is there anything you can share today about your review of the genesis of the Russia investigation, whether assets have been provided to investigate?
No, today I'm really focused just on the process of releasing this report.
Democrats in Congress have asked for Robert Mueller himself to testify. Robert Mueller remains a Justice Department employee as of this moment. Will you permit him to testify publicly to Congress?
I have no objection to Bob Mueller personally testifying.
Mr. Attorney General, it's not the Democrats who have questioned some of the process here. A Republican-appointed judge on Tuesday said you have, quote, created an environment that has caused a significant part of the American public to be concerned about these redactions. You've cleared the president on obstruction. The president is fundraising off of your comments about spying. And here you have remarks that are quite generous to the president, including acknowledging his feelings and his emotions. So what do you say to people on both sides of the aisle who are concerned that you are trying to protect the president?
Well, actually, the statements about his sincere beliefs are recognized in the report. that there was substantial evidence for that. So I'm not sure what your basis is for saying that I'm being generous to the president.
It just seems like there's a lot of effort to say, to acknowledge how this.
Well, is there another precedent for it?
No, but it's
Okay, so unprecedented is an accurate description, isn't it?
Yes. What do you say to people who are concerned that you were trying to protect the president? Eric?
There's a lot of public interest in the absence of special counsel and members of his team. Was he invited to join you up on the podium? Why is he not here? This is his report, obviously, that you're talking about today.
No, it's not. The report he did for me as the Attorney General. He is required under the regulation to provide me with a confidential report. I'm here to discuss my response to that report and my decision, entirely discretionary, to make it public, since these reports are not supposed to be made public. That's what I'm here to discuss.
Propriety for you to come out and sort of what appears to be sort of spinning the report before the public gets a chance to read it?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
And an extraordinary statement by the Attorney General of the United States describing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report, which will be released to the public to see, a nearly 2-year investigation. And as we just heard the Attorney General say, the Special Counsel's report states that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference. So no conspiracy, no coordination, no collusion, also no obstruction.
He also said that several times. It wasn't just one-time statement. He said that, made that point several times.
Yes, he also said, too, that the White House counsel and the president's personal lawyers had an opportunity to view the report. They decided not to request any redactions, nor did the president, the White House counsel, seek executive privilege to block any of it, that they wanted essentially there to be transparent. Jonathan Turley, a constitutional law professor, is with us. What did you make of this first read of this report, even though reporters and Congress have not yet been able to see the report?
Well, there was some information that we did garner from this that we didn't know before. Now, first of all, to start on a positive note, the president should be commended for waiving executive privilege. I don't know of any precedent for this extent of a waiver, and he did say that all the senior staff were made available, there were no documents withheld, and that's all in the president's favor. But we're going to likely see a lot of quite negative things come out of this that is not so favorable to the president. But what was interesting about what Barr said was a couple of things. One, he said that the information from the Russian operatives were first released through their own sources and then given to WikiLeaks. Julian Assange's lawyers are likely to really like that, because Barr then said it's not a crime to publish that information, which is, of course, what WikiLeaks did. He didn't say that WikiLeaks was working or coordinating with the Russians. So that's going to be something that you're not only going to see a lot of interest in Congress, but in London, where Assange is facing extradition. He also said that Mueller did not feel restrained by DOJ policies in deciding not to say that this was obstruction. But he also did indicate that some of those prosecutors believed an obstruction case could be made.
One interesting thing on the point you make. First of all, this started with Russia. And it was interesting to hear the Attorney General say at least 3 times, if not 4, about how thorough the investigation was into the Russian efforts, those 2 prongs he talked about. This is still something the president is somewhat fuzzy about, is the Russian interference in the campaign. The Attorney General thanked Mueller for that. But on this question of WikiLeaks, one thing I thought was interesting is he said it's not illegal to disseminate it if you didn't do the underlying hacking. And so he said under those rules, nobody from the Trump administration participated. That, in a political context, might mean something quite different, which is to say they might have disseminated it, but because they didn't have the underlying hacking, it's not illegal. That certainly will be something Congress will be looking at.
That's right. There's a difference between being exonerated and being vindicated. And to some degree, the president was vindicated by not being tied to any crime. It doesn't mean he was exonerated from blame in terms of his conduct. And much of the damage is going to be in this second volume, that dealing with the obstruction of justice. There were 10 episodes described by Bill Barr. And the effort was to do all these insular episodes and link it to an obstruction case. And he said that he and Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, accepted the definition of obstruction being put forward by Mueller's staff. Now, that indicates that they were adopting a much broader definition than Barr wanted. During his confirmation hearing, there was a memo that was discussed where he adopted a fairly narrow view of obstruction. And so it's clear that the prosecutors, I think, did not follow his logic there. And then he then said, you know what, we didn't really go there. What we asked was, assuming that obstruction theory is valid, is this a case that could be prosecuted? And both of them decided it was not.
Were you surprised to hear him say that he would have no problem with Robert Mueller testifying before Congress?
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. I mean, that goes to the sort of unprecedented level. I mean, they are being transparent in the extent to which they've made people available. So he will testify. I mean, you could almost hear the phones being picked up in Congress.
And let's go now to Weijia Jiang, who is reporting from the White House, where we may hear from the president later today. And Weijia, we heard President Trump hundreds of times call this a witch hunt. And it appears, based on the Attorney General, that this investigation has largely exonerated members of the Trump campaign.
Well, that's certainly how the president feels, and he actually tweeted out a edited clip of him saying there was no collusion multiple times, and just moments ago he sent out another tweet because clearly he was following this press conference. Right after, he sent out an image that looks like it's from the same graphics as the television show Game of Thrones, and in big letters it says "Game Over." This is from the president's Twitter account. No collusion, no obstruction for all the haters and the radical left Democrats. So what we heard from the Attorney General did sound like a victory for the president in many ways. Our colleague Paula Reed even asked him about, why he was bringing up the president's emotions and why he was talking about what he was feeling and what the president had to go through personally in talking about this document, which is extremely factual and supposed to just rely on that. And he was stoic for the most part, but he did become defensive in saying, I am just reporting the facts, and this was unprecedented, and the president went through a lot. So even before today, we anticipated another victory lap. Sources here were saying, regardless of what comes out, and to Jonathan Turley's point, there could be unsavory things that come out. But regardless of that, it doesn't matter because it's the conclusions that matter. And as you pointed out, Nora, no conspiracy, no collusion, no obstruction. These are all things that he will put in the bank and will use as he hits the campaign trail. And it could be a very powerful tool for him. So we are waiting to hear from the president personally, but certainly he is celebrating right now after that presser.
All right, Weijia Jiang, thanks so much. Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill, where Democrats will have a different view of things, of course. They say that Barr's news conference should not have happened. Nancy?
Not only do they say that it shouldn't have happened, but there is certain to be some anger here on Capitol Hill among Democrats, John, now that they have confirmation that the Attorney General did, in fact, share the findings of this report with the White House Office of Legal Counsel before anyone here on Capitol Hill was able to get a look at it. Now, Barr said that was completely according to statute and precedent, that the Office of Legal Counsel needed to review the report so that they could make a determination about whether the president was going to exert executive privilege over any of it. Still, Democrats have been saying for weeks now that they believe that the Attorney General is putting his thumb on the scale for the president in any way that he can. And that's why I think that Paula Reed really asked the key question in that press conference, the fact that he spent more time defending the president's actions, saying that he was angry, frustrated, felt hounded unfairly, than he did laying out the special counsel's explanations for why they found some of the president's behavior questionable. And so Paula asked the Attorney General whether he was, in fact, going to bat for the president in this situation, and things got a little heated. He certainly didn't like that line of questioning, but that is something that Democrats are going to continue to beat the drums about here on Capitol Hill, although there are going to be some of them that are very happy to hear that they will be able to view the unredacted version of this report. Not all of it. The Attorney General is still saying that some of it will be kept under wraps. We'll probably see a court battle about that. But the unredacted redacted report, for the most part, is going to be made available to Democrats and Republicans on key committees here on Capitol Hill.
All right, Nancy, thank you. You just heard Nancy say, Jonathan, that Democrats are angry that they shared information with the White House Office of Legal Counsel. Do they have a legitimate gripe there?
Quite frankly, no. It is a tradition in the Department of Justice to show reports that deal with individuals of this kind, not just as a courtesy to opposing counsel, but also as a sort of due process protection for the people named. There were no changes made, so this was simply a courtesy that was given to them to be able to read some of the aspects or perhaps the report itself. What was interesting to me is when he went through the 4 categories of redaction, he said that the great majority, or certainly the largest number, was related to ongoing cases. It was not related to that 4th category that frankly concerned a lot of us, because it was a little squishy when he said we're going to try to protect the reputations of individuals, which the Department of Justice does do, but he said that most of them are actually on the ongoing investigative side.
I want to bring in something we have just learned, which is now that Jerry Nadler, who is the chairman of the House Committee on the Judiciary, has now formally requested that the Honorable Robert Mueller, the special counsel, come and testify before Congress no later than May 23rd, 2019, which the Attorney General was asked would he object to this, and he said no, so we will hear from the special counsel.
Well, Jonathan did just say I can hear the phones being picked up even as we speak. You're right.
Let me ask you to clarify, because there was a moment in the press conference where a reporter asked the Attorney General, why isn't Mueller here, since it's his report? And the Attorney General responded, no, it's not. It's a report he did for me as the Attorney General. And I think this has been I want you to clarify this. He's a special counsel. He's not an independent counsel.
That's right. I think that Robert Mueller would rather drink molten lead than be at this press conference. I mean, he views his role as an FBI director type of position. He was
the longest-serving FBI director since Herbert Hoover, 12 years.
And so his view of his conduct was to create a report and give it to Main Justice, and Main Justice then handles it. That was the distinction that was lost with James Comey. When James Comey held that press conference, he stepped over that line.
Let me ask you this, Jonathan. Earlier today, you gave us 3 categories of standards of the way to look at this information. We've talked about what's indictable. Mm-hmm. We've had that part of the conversation. 2 other categories you used were impeachable and contemptible. Those 2 categories are still out there as a way to think about this report. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It is, but the thing to keep in mind on the 2nd category is that if you're going to impeach a president, you really need a sucking chest wound of an issue. I mean, I was the lead counsel in the last impeachment trial. My opposing counsel was Schiff, Adam Schiff, who was actually disturbingly good in that role. But just to give you an idea, that case, which was considered a straightforward case, took 17 months before we finished that Senate trial from the House to the Senate. So the Democrats are running out of runway if they want to take off any type of impeachment case. That schedule alone would put them right at the 2020 election.
Right. Well, Nancy Pelosi has made it clear she doesn't really even want to entertain a conversation about impeachment. One of the main concerns they had about him having this press conference, Bill Barr, is that he would lay the foundation that would be very favorable to the President of the United States before anybody had a chance to look at this report. It's interesting that he did not answer the question when he was asked by Paula Reed, are you the Attorney General for the United States, or are you the Attorney General? The criticism is that you were working as the Attorney General for Donald Trump. He did not answer that question.
Well, I must admit, I was grinning a little bit because I know Bill Barr well, and that's when you started to hear a little bit of irritation in his voice. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that Bill Barr really is cut from DOJ cloth. And that you could not ask anything more insulting to Bill Barr than that question. Now, he should not have gotten a little testy there. But Bill Barr is, as you see him, he's a very straightforward person. He doesn't really spin. He'll tell you straight up.
It was very interesting. He also referred to Congress's legitimate oversight interests, which in the coming push and pull was a kind of olive branch, if you will, from the Attorney General, saying you have legitimate reasons to be asking for these things. Obviously, the President says those questions are not legitimate.
As is giving them the report. The only thing redacted from the congressional report will be grand jury information. And Bill Barr is absolutely correct. He can't give that information to Congress. I know people have said otherwise. We just had a ruling a week ago that made it difficult even for a federal judge to release Rule 60 information.
Discretion.
All right. Ed O'Keefe is in Washington. He's also following these latest developments on the Mueller report. Ed, what's your observation today?
Gail, good to see you guys. And I want to pick up on what John was talking about earlier, this idea of the 10 episodes that the Attorney General discussed and how they're going to be picked apart in a political context as opposed to a legal context. Because remember, there are multiple congressional investigations still underway, especially the Judiciary Committee's focus on the potential for obstruction of justice. And so while the Attorney General and his team may have decided that there's no legal danger for the president, politically, it's probably going to become the central focus. And he gave us there quite a tease. We don't expect to see the full report until later today, but the idea that there may be 10 episodes involving the president where obstruction of justice might have been a potential concern is going to be enough for Washington to continue to pick this over. We should remind people, too, part of the reason we're so concerned about all of this, a majority of Americans, including Democrats and Republicans, want to see this report. But a majority of Americans also want Washington to move on. Majority of Republicans and independents, 2/3 of Democrats say the Democratic Party, as it controls the House, should continue digging. But it looks as if that won't happen until at least after May 23rd, when Robert Mueller now is asked to testify. And we should remind folks as well, the Attorney General himself will face questions, even stronger ones than he got from our colleagues there at the Justice Department this morning in early May, when he's going to testify before 2 committees to discuss the findings of this report. So a lot more to come as the day progresses, but certainly the push here to release it fulfills the wishes of Americans who want to see this report and be able to pick it apart for themselves.
Well, we keep hearing this report is 400 pages, Jonathan. What would you look at first? What would your advice be to people who said, yeah, I can't wait to read it? What would you where would you send them?
I quite frankly, I think most people are going to skip the collusion part and go straight to obstruction. First of all, that's going to have the least amount of redactions, because the obstruction investigation largely gathered its information from senior White House staff. Its footprint was not in the grand jury. On collusion, all that stuff was globally a global reach in terms of banks and other sources. They had to pull them through the grand jury. So it's obstruction where you're going to see these 10 episodes. And we have to look for linkages and also key players. Once again, I think that looking for Don McGahn and his statements is probably going to be the most reliable. He was at the center of these. And the episode that we're going to probably go to first is there was a report that the president did want to fire key players in the investigation, and that Don McGahn refused. Now, if that is true, it means that the president did his level best to create an obstruction case against himself, and they create a sort of human wall to protect him from himself.
And that goes to your earlier distinctions between what's indictable and what is something that people might, when measuring this president against the highest standards of a presidency, might find a discrepancy there.
That's right. We don't define a president by, the criminal code. We hope that the standard is a bit higher than that. The interesting thing here is that it's difficult to obstruct a crime that doesn't exist. So you have a president who knew he didn't commit a crime, because a crime, in the view of the Department of Justice, did not exist, and yet he did his level best to do the near impossible, to actually obstruct a crime that he didn't believe he committed. And the thing that kept him from crossing that Rubicon may have been a couple of these staffers who refused to carry out his orders. So we're going to look at whether, in fact, those reports are true. And if so, it raises troubling issues.
And what if the investigation, Jonathan, because it was into this collusion question, but it was also into whether the Russians had done any interference in the election. So that was being potentially obstructed as well. If somebody's making it more difficult for the special counsel to go look after that, they're making it difficult not just on the collusion question, but also on the question of whether the Russians were involved in the election, which the special counsel concluded they were.
That's right. And in fact, the obstruction statute talks about obstructing and impeding, but it also talks about influencing. And that influencing issue is something that has always concerned us about the president, because he really clearly did not recognize traditional lines separating the White House from the FBI. And what was fascinating is that after he fired Comey, which may be the biggest political
That's what I was going to ask. But then
blunder.
why did he fire James Comey? It asked James Comey not to continue to investigate his national security advisor, Michael Flynn. No obstruction there?
Well, once again, this will be interesting in the report because the word was in the press that virtually everyone in the White House said, for the love of Mike, do not do that. You will torch your own administration. And reportedly, the only person that said, I think that's a good idea, was Jared Kushner. But apparently, if that's true, that's all the president needed. But what's fascinating is it did exactly what his advisors told him to do. It set his administration on fire. Then when it came to this report of his wanting to fire other people, it sounds as if, and we'll see if this is true, critical players put themselves really between the president and those individuals. They may have saved this president from a more serious obstruction.
I just want to recap, too, just very quickly as we continue this conversation, just what we heard from the Attorney General for those who are just tuning in again, that according to the Attorney General's reading of the special counsel's report, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated. He also said no collusion by any Americans in the IRA's illegal activity. The IRA, talking about the Russians in this case, not the Irish, but the Russians in this case, which was, and I think always important to remember, there was a coordinated effort, though, by the Russian government to try and influence the 2016 election on numerous fronts, and that is still an effort that our intelligence community is trying to beat back to this day.
Yeah, and you know, one of I think the two beneficiaries of this press conference was Julian Assange and Stone. You know, by saying that nobody coordinated to get this information out certainly helps Stone's case. But the big beneficiary is Julian Assange. That is his saying that, look, if you just publish this information, it's not a crime. So we will have to see in the coming days whether new charges are brought against Assange that suggest he was a more active player with relation to the Russians.
And just to remind everybody, so I'm sorry, just to remind everybody why that's important too, is those emails were leaked of John Podesta and the Clinton campaign on the very day, for instance, that the Billy Bush tape came out. Like there was this coordinating effort to influence it.
But your point is that good for them legally. That they also, and it's unproved, and we're going to look in the report and see if it's there, if those WikiLeaks emails were passed along through a conduit, but that conduit, that's only just bad politically because they weren't involved in the underlying hacking, which is the legal tripwire that has to be tripped.
That's right. Barr really was sweeping, and he said no American engaged in conspiracy or coordination with the Russians. And that really does give a clean slate, not just for Trump, but many other people. And that's the reason I think the focus is going to shift over to those 10 episodes and whether what the president did was appropriate. Now, that question can involve impeachable conduct. The Congress can view those 10 episodes as a mosaic to say, look, we don't believe that you acted appropriately or we believe you acted abusively. But it's a hard case to make when the Department of Justice is saying we don't believe there's underlying criminal conduct here.
And doesn't the tug-of-war politically now is what standard to use, because the Attorney General has now summarized the report twice, and so in terms of a political fight, he has set the standard and said the president's got a clean bill of health. It now is up to anybody on the Democratic side to make the case, no, under our standard, which is a political standard, which is different than a legal one, the following things are bad. But they've got an uphill fight.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Democrats, even after the initial summary was given to Congress, came forward, people like Schiff and others, and saying, no, we clearly have collusion. Well, look, they're now in opposition, not just to Bill Barr and the Deputy Attorney General, they're taking a position in opposition to Mueller himself, that it's clear that that part of the report did not find collusion, certainly in any criminal sense. And if it's not collusion in the criminal sense, the question is, well, what are we talking about if they found no conspiracy, no coordination?
You know, Ed said something interesting when he said Americans want to see the report, but there's also a big majority that say it's time to move on. Jonathan, is it now time to move on? Is it still too early to tell until we see the report? Based on what we heard this morning, is certainly very complimentary for President Trump. Very good news, it seems, for President Trump.
Oh, for God's sake, don't switch over to those political analysts. You don't want to hear from them. No, but it's actually not time to move on. I know that sounds self-serving, but there are going to be difficult questions raised, I think, in this obstruction material when we look at these episodes.
All right, John, really, thank you so much. And coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming service, CBSN. Watch it at cbsnews.com or download the CBS News app.
So
Dedicated CBS News special report. We heard from the Attorney General his overriding conclusion based on the Mueller report. He says no collusion or coordination and no obstruction of justice, which is what he had said before in his sort of 4-page summary. There's still a whole lot of questions.
Yeah, and the release of the report is imminent. We're told it's going to be posted on the DOJ's website. That's when you will be able to read it. We've got the printers ready. We're going to print it and literally go page by page. You got to remember, even though the Attorney General has concluded there is no crime that has been committed, there may be some very embarrassing information for the president.
There certainly could be.
In these papers. Ricky Kleeman, Rebecca Roife are still with us. Both of them are legal analysts. Ladies, what are your sort of top takeaways? Ricky?
I think my top takeaway has to do with the fact that there was a press conference at all before the report was released, because what this permitted the Attorney General to do was exactly the question that was asked by Paula Reed, our reporter, in Washington, which has to do with spin. So when you have the report being issued in an hour or so, and you have the Attorney General speaking first, and he defends the president of being in an unprecedented situation where he was frustrated and emotional as a result of trying to take charge of the country and yet being under all of this suspicion, and that therefore his emotional content and context created some of his comments and some of his acts, as if that is an excuse. Well, all defendants and suspects in a crime are emotional and very frustrated. It doesn't mean that they should therefore commit a crime. I found that whole section of Attorney General Barr's summary here this morning would have been better off not said.
In fact, what he says is that there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by the sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency.
Well, I assume that comes from his tweets and from his public statements, because he wasn't questioned.
Exactly. That was my question. I mean, this is him sort of inferring intent, desire. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, Rebecca. What did you think of that?
I mean, I agree that I think that, I can't quite figure out what the purpose of this press conference was, other than to say that the president didn't assert executive privilege, which is a piece of news that I'm happy to have. And, I would have been just as happy to have it 2 hours later when I could also be reading the report, but I'm happy to have that piece of news. Other than that, I'm not really sure why he did this. So, and as to your question about, the conversation about his emotions, again, he had an opportunity to say, the president had an opportunity to say all of these things under oath and chose not to. So I think it's sort of strange that this public statement is being made on his behalf by an attorney general who has a sworn obligation to the Constitution, not to the particular president. I understand that the executive is a complicated beast, but he doesn't report to the president. And so it's important to remember that. The other thing I just wanted to say also is that this is a little bit the same as his summary report, in that he's sort of stating legal conclusions. And I don't care anymore. I just want to see the facts. As you said, I think American people just want to see the facts. They're kind of sick of hearing what everybody thinks is in the report or what the report means without actually being able to read the report.
It was really interesting to hear him say it, even though it was in his summary, because hearing him say it at times, he seemed like a White House spokesperson. I mean, using his tone and his inflection, that kind of stuff. Let's go to Ed O'Keefe, who's in our D.C. bureau. He's our CBS News political correspondent. Ed, what's the immediate reaction on Capitol Hill right now?
Much to what you guys have been saying, that since when did the Attorney General become a spokesperson for the president? But, with about maybe an hour and a half until we see the thing for ourselves or are able to, I think most people may just want to be patient and read those 400 pages whenever they arrive. The only thing that really stood out to me in this whole thing is the fact that the Attorney General gave us quite the to-be-continued tease, and the idea that there are 10 episodes that are recounted in this report that may have been grounds for potential obstruction of justice charges. And all I wonder, based on nothing other than what he just said, is does the report demonstrate how emotionally wrought the president was and explain those 10 episodes in part, that's why the Attorney General felt that he could explain and contextualize the president's behavior and emotions as he took office, and his concerns that this investigation was upending his early presidency. But beyond that, I mean, it is unprecedented. But remember, this is the same criticism that James Comey got at the height of the 2016 campaign when he came out to explain things. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The difference here, perhaps, is that Barr, of course, was appointed by this sitting president and has written things in the past that suggest he was critical of this whole affair to begin with. And also, frankly, watching him respond to just those few questions from reporters suggests that the testimony we'll get from him next month, early May, is going to be quite explosive, because he clearly did not enjoy the suggestion that he's speaking out on behalf of the president. So we'll see. The other thing to keep in mind now is, since he said that the special counsel Robert Mueller could testify, there was a note almost immediately sent by the Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler to Mr. Mueller saying, please show up to testify before May 23rd. That's the Thursday before Memorial Day, when the summer recess, or another summer recess, begins. That too signals that we probably will at some point soon hear from Robert Mueller himself, once we all get a chance to digest this 400-page report starting later today.
So I'm curious, Ed, no collusion, no obstruction, but like you said, a tremendous tease with these sort of 10 episodes. I'm wondering what the mood is on Capitol Hill in regards to all these other investigations, these congressional investigations. Do they feel bolstered by what they're hearing so far, or defeated?
Well, and we got to remind folks, what the special counsel report did or establishes, and what the Justice Department does, is in regards to the legal concerns around what may have happened. But the political, nonpartisan political report, well, they will be partisan, but political investigations from Capitol Hill, are going to be an entirely different matter with an entirely different burden of proof. And these 10 episodes that the Attorney General alludes to today are likely to be the basis of some of this. There is an obstruction of justice investigation being led by the House Judiciary Committee, but there's a host of other investigations ongoing. Just last night, the House Financial Services Committee subpoenaed 9 banks for Mr. Trump's financial records, including Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. You have ongoing battles over whether or not the president and his family are unfairly profiting from the hotel down the street from the White House, and the fact that foreign heads of state and corporate leaders stay there while he's the sitting president. You have investigations into other aspects of the administration, and they're likely going to continue in one way or another. But you look at polling that we've done here at CBS and others have done elsewhere. While a majority of Americans want to see this report and be able to read it for themselves, they also want Washington to move on. And while a majority of Democrats may think it's okay to keep this up, the rest of the country doesn't necessarily think so. So there will be a big political risk, especially if this 400-page report so clearly lays out that the president didn't do anything illegal.
So, Ricky and Rebecca, to that point, listen, decisions are made by prosecutors and juries, for that matter, all the time, where some of the evidence might be squirrely, might be suspicious, but the decision was innocent. That's basically what Bill Barr said today. Despite everything you might read that's damning, the answer is not guilty. At what point do we say, as we usually do, we're a nation of laws? The lawmaker said there's no crime. Move on.
Well, we have to move on that there's no crime, because the lawmaker has said that there is no crime. So at least as to what was in the special counsel's purview, there is no crime for which the president or any member of his campaign could be prosecuted as to the issue of conspiracy, as I call it, rather than collusion and obstruction of justice. However, the Congress is under a completely separate standard, because it has to do with character. It has to do with issues of what is appropriate in office. So that's a separate standard. In addition, when you talk about no crime, we are dealing not only with investigations within the Congress, but we are dealing with criminal investigations, particularly in the state of New York, the District Attorney's Office in Manhattan, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, as to various aspects of President Trump, his foundation, his organization. So those cases may or may not prove that there is a crime. But when we're dealing with the four corners of the 400-page Mueller report, crime is now off the table.
That is significant.
Yes, it's highly significant.
Although, I mean, we really shouldn't can't forget that crimes have been charged. So it's like, I mean, you know, it's just memory is short, especially because there's just so much that comes out. But there have been multiple indictments. Now, Ricky's right that those indictments are not for conspiracy, but all the time prosecutors charge other sorts of crimes when they have lots of evidence that certain crimes have happened, but not enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and then they prove other crimes that they can prove. So I just, again, we just have to wait to read this report, because I think there's so many unanswered questions, and maybe the answers are all going to be redacted, but I really think we need to read the report to actually, before we move on, or before we don't move on, or before we get, you know, before we do anything, we just need to figure out what the facts are.
I think Rebecca makes a great point here, because we are looking at the president and particularly the people close to him, and perhaps in that myopic vision that we forget that one of the first statements that Attorney General Barr made today was about the indictment of the Russians for doing the hacking. In addition to that, lest we forget that Paul Manafort was the president's campaign manager, and although he was not charged or convicted for campaign offenses, he's doing a lot of time in prison. Then Mike Flynn is not yet disposed of, so we have to deal with Mike Flynn. And we have all the people who lied. So,
but isn't it curious, though, that he applauded the Mueller investigation for indicting those Russians and did not mention any of the other people who have been indicted?
I think that's
who are so close to the president.
That is totally significant. I mean, and part of it's like people. I just think people want to. I mean, I want to have faith in him because he's the person standing there in charge of the Department of Justice, making important decisions for the country, and he just sometimes does things that undermines my ability to trust him. And one of them was the press conference to start with. One of them was that 4-page summary. Why? Like, why does he keep doing this if he's trying to help the people have faith in the legitimacy of this process?
I want to play a little bit of sound because, you know, you mentioned just about a minute ago about, you know, Congress having sort of a different standard than the legal system. And there has been a lot of questions about why on earth Mueller left obstruction of justice open. Why he would say, I cannot exonerate, I can't make a call on obstruction of justice. Here's the evidence. Was the intention that Congress would be the one making that call?
I think that
Robert Mueller, Attorney General Barr was asked that. I want to play that sound, and then I want to get your reaction. Do we have it? That was my long lead up to get the sound ready.
After nearly 2 years of investigation, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of warrants, and witness interviews, the special counsel confirmed that the Russian government sponsored efforts to illegally interfere with the 2016 presidential election, but did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts.
Okay, so my bad. He was asked, that's sort of a portion of his statement, but he was asked that question directly, and he said that there was no indication that Robert Mueller wanted this to be decided by Congress.
Correct.
But he didn't indicate whether or not Robert Mueller wanted him to make that final decision, which is what has happened.
I just want to say that prosecutors have a complicated role. And normally, run-of-the-mill prosecutions, you just go into the grand jury and you get your true bill or you get your no true bill, and you either bring charges or you don't bring charges. But your ultimate obligation is the duty to do justice and to serve the public. And the public has a very big interest in every criminal prosecution. Here, it's far, far bigger. And so you're part of your obligation as prosecutor, which Barr did not really explain well, is to the public. And you don't only have an obligation to bring charges or not charges. It's essential to your job, but it's not the whole thing. And here, some degree of transparency is absolutely essential. He's kind of acknowledged that, but he keeps backtracking. And I mean, why not? Why not go to the court and say, look, any one of these exceptions could apply. Let's at least get the grand jury material to Congress so they can look at it. It was done in Watergate. It was done with the Starr report. There's absolutely no reason to do that, and he's not saying why. And I want to hear the answer to that question.
It's 10:34 in New York. We are waiting the release of the report. I'm actually looking at a picture coming. It appears to be from the White House where the presidential podium is set up. So we may take that if the president decides to talk, and you know he'd be happy to talk about this.
He's speaking at a Wounded Warrior event, so he has, I'm sure, preset comments, but the president is prone to you know,
ad-lib.
Yes, exactly.
And we're told that there's a 30-page rebuttal that he has already drafted.
From his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Correct. Which Rebecca sort of pointed out is different than, you know, White House counsel or something like that. Sorry, what were we going to say, Ricky?
Well, it just seems to me that it is so unnecessary to have this rebuttal. He can take his victory lap now. He couldn't have gotten more than he got this morning from the Attorney General, not only in what the Attorney General said, but in the way the Attorney General said it. And so why not let it sit? By virtue of doing this rebuttal, particularly from Rudy Giuliani, because you know that it will be painstaking and perhaps caustic, is that the result of that is you prolong the media conversation about not only the Mueller report, but now you prolong a conversation about the rebuttal. And why should the president's lawyer put the president, frankly, in the position of having the media able to criticize the rebuttal when they would be in the catbird seat by letting the media criticize the Mueller report? It just seems to me a needless move, and one that is typical of what Mr. Giuliani has been doing throughout. Though some people might say in retrospect that all of the times that people like me have criticized Rudy Giuliani's public statements and appearances all over Sunday TV talk shows, that perhaps Rudy Giuliani was the wisest one of all, because look at the result he got.
Yeah, there is a debate over whether or not this is all a brilliant tactic, because you're right. What we will talk about is this 30-page rebuttal, and perhaps we will talk about some other things that are going on in the country.
Did y'all find it interesting that Barr confirmed that Robert Mueller did not think on his own? Not only did he just leave it up to Barr to make a decision, but Mueller, according to Barr, said, I do not believe a crime was committed.
I found that one of the most interesting things he said, and it's another reason that the Congress is correct in calling Robert Mueller to testify, because we need to hear those words come out of Robert Mueller's mouth. It also certainly came out that there were mixed feelings amongst prosecutors about the question of whether or not there was obstruction, which is why it became this ambiguous count as to whether or not it should meet the standard. Some prosecutors, obviously, at another time in another place, might have indicted for obstruction. Ultimately, here it was in equipoise.
And to your point, the Attorney General confirmed that there may have been, did I hear this right? There may have been other prosecutors on the special counsel team who thought that they could have brought this case. In fact, here's what the Attorney General said about his conversation with Mr. Mueller.
Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision. Instead, we accepted the special counsel's legal framework for purposes of our analysis and evaluated the evidence as presented by the special counsel in reaching our conclusions.
So what are we to make of that?
I mean, I just want to say, I sort of think it's relevant that Mueller's not there. I mean, you know, Barr can speak for Mueller, and maybe he's speaking accurately, and we'll learn at some later point, but why wouldn't you have the special counsel standing right there with you? You know, to me that seems interesting, and it's sort of part of that spin that Barr is making, that this report was for me, that I am the ultimate decider here, and kind of kicking Mueller into the background at this point. And to me, I'm not so interested in Barr's summaries and what he has to say, because maybe he doesn't. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he really is just, you know, following the facts and his opinion on the facts. But at this point, his credibility is somewhat undermined about being apolitical in that way. So I'd like to see Mueller stand behind this press conference.
Let me push back on that, Counselor, if I may, with respect. You're saying you don't care so much about what Barr has to say. The Attorney General, at the end of the day, was the one who commissioned this special counsel report investigation. It wasn't an independent investigation. It was commissioned by the Attorney General for the Attorney General.
Well, sort of, but the reason why it's not done just by Department of, I mean, you can just get one of your prosecutors to look into something. You don't need to convene a special counsel. Why do you convene a special counsel? Because there's a certain sense that you, as too much of a connection to that political actor to be involved in this investigation. It's like a kind of conflict of interest. So while you're right that special counsel is different from independent counsel in that he's not quite as independent from the Attorney General, the regulations do create quite a bit of independence for just that purpose, because there's a recognition that if you're investigating top executive officials, the Attorney General is going to have a hard time doing that because he's so connected to the president in all sorts of other ways.
I see you bobbing your head.
Well, as we may recall, what happened was in the firing of Jim Comey, the person who wrote the memorandum that was used as the basis for the firing at the request of the president was Rod Rosenstein. Right. So Rod Rosenstein, who became the acting Attorney General, in essence, by being the deputy, because, well, let me rephrase that. He was the Deputy Attorney General. He's not the Acting Attorney General. But he became the person in charge of the Russia investigation because of Jeff Sessions' recusal. So here is Rod Rosenstein smack dab in the middle because he's the person who writes the memorandum that fires Jim Comey and then is confronted with the fact about what the evidence, at least at that point, or at least the beginnings of what you may believe and then what you know, which is different than what you can prove, was pointing into the president's campaign. So he's compromised already himself. So he asked for the appointment of the special counsel. Steve Bannon has said that the firing of Jim Comey was the greatest mistake in history that was done by President Trump because it really created the office of the special counsel. There is no doubt about that.
So, Ed, I know you've been standing by listening to this whole conversation. You know, I had asked you about all the other sort of investigations taking place, but also there's the question of impeachment, and everyone was sort of holding their breath to figure out whether or not the Democrats had moved in that direction. But it seems like since the midterm elections, the Democrats have sort of been lukewarm on the idea, not more than lukewarm, almost cold on the idea of pursuing any sort of impeachment. And I presume what we know so far about the Mueller report would just sort of reinforce that.
Right, and most Democrats when asked will say they wanted to see the results of this report before they made that decision for themselves. So, you know, at some point now in the next few days, we may get a better sense of whether there's enough Democratic support, at least, to proceed down that route. But remember what Speaker Pelosi has said about impeachment. There has to be overwhelming bipartisan support and evidence to move in that direction. And if you believe the Attorney General's preview of a full report, that would suggest we're not there yet. She has weighed in from Europe, where she's traveling right now, to say that the Attorney General has confirmed the staggering partisan effort by the Trump administration to spin the public's view of the Mueller report, complete with acknowledgement that the Trump team received a sneak preview. It's more urgent than ever that Special Counsel Mueller testify before Congress. Let's just fact-check one piece of that. The Trump team is the Trump legal team, his lawyer, pursuant to a federal law that allows them to see it if they're the subject of this investigation. And now we know that Special Counsel Mueller probably will testify at some point before May 23rd, per the request of the Judiciary Committee and the permission given this morning by the Attorney General to let him do that. But, you know, right now, at least, in these moments before the report is released to the world, the concern among Democrats is that Bill Barr came out and did what he did. But there's an old adage in this town: if you're fighting over the process, you're losing. And so, in essence, that's all the Democrats have right now, at least at this hour. In 2 hours, it might be something completely different, because the report will actually be released. But they have done a pretty quick job overnight into today of trying to discredit the Attorney General by calling him out as a spokesperson for the president instead of serving as the chief law enforcement officer.
So then, as we move forward then beyond this report, the 400-page, I don't know, maybe by next weekend, after everyone goes away for the weekend, they have a great long weekend, no one's going to be interested in the 400-page report. Do you think that this will be a factor in the 2020 campaign?
There's no doubt that Democrats are going to try, or at least draw attention to the president, his behavior, his decisions, his conduct, his character. But I think you talk to most people who work for presidential campaigns right now, most Democrats out in the field, most Democrats who show up to events in these early primary states, and they'll tell you, we know we've got issues with the president, we don't like him, and we want to defeat him. But if we're going to win, we have to do what congressional candidates did last year, which is talk about what Democrats would be for, what they would do if they had total control of Washington. And that's been a tricky balancing act here early on, because a lot of that isn't necessarily breaking through. But if the party expects to repeat what it was able to pull off next November, they know that they've got to do that. That's why you've seen a lot of nervousness among the more moderate members of the House Democratic Caucus over the last few months about this talk of impeachment, or riling up supporters of the president by saying things that are extra critical of the president, because they know that they've got to go home and answer for, what did you do about health care? What did you do about salvaging the economy? What did you do about, paying off my student loans? And kitchen table issues that are a far more immediate concern to what Americans care about. For example, the president, we're going to see here in a little bit at the White House, is gathering today with members of the Wounded Warrior Project and the Soldier Ride, which is a multi-day bike ride designed to empower veterans. And he's going to be meeting with people who are going to be part of that and other military leaders. That is counter-programming, if there ever was one. And that was a long-scheduled event that just happens to run into what the Attorney General decided to announce today. In Kentucky, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell today is holding an event announcing that they're going to be passing a bill in the Senate to raise the federal tobacco age from 18 to 21. This has actually been a pretty big bipartisan concern in Washington, that the tobacco industry has to be better regulated in order to get those e-cigarettes and those Juul devices out of the hands of high schoolers. That's the kind of kitchen table issue, not at all related to this, that is more likely to break through with certain voters than this report. Again, a majority of Americans want to see it, but a majority of Americans also want to move on. And so it's going to be really tricky for Democrats to try to keep this issue going if this report has essentially concluded the president did nothing wrong, and he and Republicans attempt to move on.
10:45 now. We still don't have the report, and it has not arrived in the hands of congressional officials yet. We haven't gotten word of that.
Right.
So the way the process goes is they get it, then we get it?
Exactly. Essentially, in the next hour or so, I think it's safe to say, as the Attorney General said earlier, the leaders of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee and other senior congressional leaders will be handed CD-ROMs. When was the last time anyone got a CD-ROM?
What is this, the 90s? Exactly.
Well, someone else was joking, you're also going to get 12 free hours of America Online with your Mueller report.
Right, like who's got a computer that still takes CDs?
Well, actually, ironically, David, most of the computers owned by the federal government and the legislative branch do still support CD-ROMs, because they don't necessarily purchase the most advanced equipment.
Touche. I want to piggyback off one of the things that you were talking about, the fact check, and I want to bring in the legal ladies. For Nancy Pelosi to suggest that the president's team got a sneak peek is that something's a little untoward. That's not the case here.
Well, it isn't the case, because it is true, as Ed noted, that there is an ethics in government law that allows the president's legal counsel to decide if any of the material should be subject to executive privilege, because you have the right to assert executive privilege. And what that means is if the president has had conversations, private conversations with someone within his administration or other person, that he has the right to say, no, 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 I want to fight this issue in the courts, that you cannot let these out. Same kind of reasoning as between any privilege, attorney-client, psychotherapist-patient. There are some things that people ought to be able to say in private that will not come forth to the world. The president, very much applauded by the Attorney General, said we will not assert executive privilege, or the President's counsel says we won't assert executive privilege as to anything. So it's all available, which was magnanimous on the part of the president. There's no doubt about that. But it was certainly noted to be magnanimous by the Attorney General.
When you say that, are you talking about the White House counsel, the president, like the counsel
White
for the
House
president,
counsel, not Rudy Giuliani?
Because Rudy Giuliani has a 30-page...
No, not Rudy Giuliani.
So what's he responding to?
Well, no. First of all, the president has waived through his counsel executive privilege, which firmly means that everything is out there. So Rudy Giuliani, in his separate role as a personal counsel to the president and whoever else is working with Mr. Giuliani, they are writing a rebuttal. I assume, I'm making this up, so let me take that as I assume, that he is going to be responding to the 10 episodes of obstruction of justice.
So Rudy Giuliani would be aware of what's in the report then?
Yes, I assume that he is aware of what's in the report, or at least if the president would be aware of what's in the report through the White House counsel, or Rudy Giuliani has taken the bold move, which many lawyers have done, which is to guess what might be in a report and to go forth and just do a political document that is couched as a legal document.
I just want to add, though, to what you said, that this Ethics in Government Act provision is part of what makes this situation kind of unique and a little uncharted.
Right.
And the thing is that in the ways that Barr seems to want to accept the way it's unique, he's accepting the way it's unique. And in other ways, he's kind of retreating behind, oh, this is the way normal DOJ policy works, like we just charge or we don't charge. In fact, this is a really difficult situation, and we really have to look at a lot of moving pieces and a lot of different roles in order to figure out what the right thing to do is here. And when he sort of acts like, well, my hands are tied because this is DOJ policy, this is really different, and that's just one example.
I want to go back to what we talked about earlier about the president's intent in terms of his behavior and obstructing justice, and what Bill Barr had to say. It jumped out to a lot of people. It jumped out to Paula Reed. She asked him directly about that. I want to play some of that sound.
Mr. Attorney General, let's start with Democrats who have questioned some of the process here. A Republican-appointed judge on Tuesday said you have, quote, created an environment that has caused a significant part of the American public to be concerned about these redactions. You've cleared the president on obstruction. The president is fundraising off of your comments about spying. And here you have remarks that are quite generous to the president, including acknowledging his feelings and his emotions. So what do you say to people on both sides of the aisle who are concerned that you are trying to protect the president?
Well, actually, the statements about his sincere beliefs are recognized in the report, that there was substantial evidence for that. So I'm not sure what your basis is for saying that I am being generous to the president.
You face an unprecedented situation. It just seems like there's a lot of effort to go out of your way to acknowledge how this.
Well, is there another precedent for it?
No, but it's unusual.
Okay, so unprecedented is an accurate description, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you say to people who are concerned that you were trying to protect the president?
I thought it was interesting that he said substantial evidence. He used air quotes, which, I know it means a quote, but sort of in casual talk, it sort of means
like that.
sarcasm. Yeah. But listen, I want to ask each of you sort of your take on it. Let's start with Ed, because he's out there in Washington, D.C. Ed, you heard the question, and we had talked about the statement where he, talked about the sincere feelings of the president, but he never spoke, or the president never spoke to any of the investigators.
He provided written answers to questions from Mueller's team. We know that much. And so somewhere in those written answers, perhaps it speaks to his emotions or his state of mind.
Will we see those written answers?
I assume we will, but, stay tuned. We don't know for certain. Unless there's something in those answers that applies to those 4 areas of redaction, we may see them if we're getting all the data that was compiled by the investigators, and we'll see. It's either going to be summarized or we'll get the raw answers itself. Again, we simply do not know. We literally are the pregame show to the big reveal that is coming here in the coming minutes. And so if you're at home, get your lunch, pop your popcorn, hit refresh on cbsnews.com/Mueller in a little bit, and you may be able to enjoy the rest of your day reading a 400-page report, which we should point out is quite well written if it's written by the guys that have been filing all the court cases over the last 2 years. There's some very good writers who work for the Justice Department and provide us with some clear prose. But anyway, look, the Attorney General clearly doesn't like the insinuation that he is defending the president and didn't want to go there with Paula. And, we will see how the Justice Department responds to those accusations through the rest of today. But again, that press conference may become a real quick sub-note and forgotten moment, depending on what is in this report once we get a chance to see it. Everyone wants to see it. A lot of people will spend time digesting it. Clearly, he was trying to set the table and set some expectations and give us some answers on camera that we'll probably have to use. But we'll see what the report itself actually says. Rebecca?
I mean, I think that if you want to defend Barr, I could see you doing it by saying, look, he believes in a strong presidency. He feels like this investigation from the very beginning weakened the presidency itself, not Donald Trump, but the presidency. And I think that's what he's sitting there thinking, and I think that's why he's so frustrated, because what he's doing is this very, sort of typical conservative thing of being like, look, you're weakening the president, and the president needs to have this much power to keep our country safe. To me, it seems a little bit stubborn not to engage with what she was actually asking, which was there are a lot of people out there, whether you like it or not, or whether you meant it or not, who are interpreting your conduct in a certain kind of way. You didn't have to say spying. You could have said surveillance. And using the president's talking points is beyond what you need to do in order to end this investigation in such a way that people can see what they see and they don't see what they don't see. You can have your political views, but that stuff was unnecessary, and I don't think he addressed that, and you know, to me that's kind of frustrating.
Here's the flip to that. I think of some of the good folks in Louisiana where I grew up who watched that and said, I don't care what's in the 400 pages, the man just gave his conclusion, the answer is no, I've known it all along, move on.
And I'm turning off the TV now.
Bingo. I'm not even watching all this.
I'm not looking at my phone, and I'm going
And I'm not on Twitter.
And I am certainly not looking at the 400 pages because I'm more concerned about my job, I'm concerned about my health care, I'm concerned about the fact that I got a smaller tax refund or no refund at all. But I want to, while saying that, go back to this whole issue of the president being frustrated, because as a criminal lawyer, that concept just absolutely floors me.
Why?
Because the whole idea that I'm frustrated and so I can therefore say certain things that may or may not wind up being amounting to a crime, but at least some prosecutors think it is and some prosecutors think it isn't, but that I can say these things and I'm excused because I'm frustrated. I mean, I just find that coming from a legal spokesperson to be over the top.
I would also like to add to that I think this idea that the president has done nothing wrong, I think we have to just take a step back and say, you can say he's done nothing criminal, but I have seen with my eyes, and so have we all, plenty of things that he has done that are wrong. These norms are the norms that support our democracy, and he's run right over them. And this situation which we find ourselves in, where people don't believe the Attorney General, is his work. Because if we didn't have a president who's out there saying this is a witch hunt, the stormtrooper Department of Justice in scare quotes, we would not have a situation where people were looking at Attorney General Barr and being like, I'm not sure what he's doing. You would just be like, okay, well, that's the Department of Justice, and this damage is his damage. So
somebody
again,
ought to investigate Michael Cohen's father.
I'm just saying that for Congress to look into this, or for the American people to know this, whatever the facts are, I already know because I already saw it. And there's a difference there's like a world of difference between a crime and what is wrong. And this democracy is not just kept up by preventing criminal activity. It's also kept up by respecting these institutions and norms that we have that he hasn't done.
Well, that's fair, but respecting the norms doesn't fall under the legal purview, right?
No,
respecting the norms is, you know...
Sure. But it's not nothing. It really isn't.
Oh no, I hear you. Yeah. I'm just sort of pushing back on that. There has been 2 years of ad nauseum hysteria, right? Yeah. And this is not a left or right opinion. It's just the world has been consumed by it, right? And so if the answer is no crime, that is so valuably significant, right? And sort of the lighthouse of today. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it was the dinner party conversation in places all around the country for 2 years. Oh, I'm sure this was obstruction. This is the one that does it. Of course this is obstruction. And then the other side saying, or the lawyers in us saying, you have to wait.
But it was the brilliance of the public relations team of Trump to move the goal. Move the goal to that. Because actually, oh my God, like why is that what determines whether this president has done something wrong? I mean, it is not. I mean, you want a president who's not committed a crime, but you want more from your president. And I feel like the fact that people are willing to say, oh, he didn't commit a crime, so I don't care anymore, that's his genius. But like, it's a little upsetting.
But even the methodology, like the thinking and the methodology to come to that conclusion is also sort of debatable. The thing about obstruction of justice is it is debatable whether or not there needs to be an underlying crime, right? That's one of the legal debates, right? William Barr, it looks, has come to the conclusion that because there was no coordination or collusion, then there cannot be obstruction.
But not everyone thinks that way.
And not every constitutional scholar.
And there are people sitting in jail on different principles of obstruction of justice. I mean, lots of them. So, you know, again, I don't think it's necessary to have the debate over whether or not it's a crime. Again, because it's an academic debate. He's not getting charged.
Yeah.
Right.
What matters, what matters is the factual support, and which is why, like, this whole thing, I mean, I'm so happy to be here talking to you, but, like, why are we talking for 2 hours about his second summary of this thing we haven't seen? Like,
because we still haven't seen it.
I know, but, like, the thing is, we actually just need the facts. Like, no more talk about what's a crime and what's not a crime, or legal conclusions and not legal conclusions. I just want to know what happened and whether it's so bad that having this person as president is dangerous or concerning.
So what we want to know are, you know, first and foremost, this meddling, right? This Russian meddling in the election. This is what started this whole thing. But I think also we want to know, can we still have faith in this system, right? That, and when it comes to the conversation about impeachment, there doesn't need to be a crime a crime doesn't have to occur for there to be an impeachable offense to occur. Right. Because the idea of impeaching a president is saying, you know, we as a country do not have faith in this person. We need to reverse our decision, right? And so you totally make a lot of sense. And that we've sort of like dropped the bar to, is the president or the people around him, are they criminals?
Right. And only 7 of them are criminals, by the way. Just don't forget, 7 people indicted. So only 7 people around the president are criminals, and not the president himself. Okay, I'm going to go on and like everything's fine. You know?
There's a whole lot more to discuss.
Well, and when you're dealing with the issues that could be possible for impeachment, but they also are simply there for the Judiciary Committee, for the Oversight Committee, and therefore for the American people. You know, it's an interesting factor when you consider that this is now 2019, because we are now we're a year away and some months from a presidential election, and which is why some of the candidates on the Democratic side have simply said, and including, by the way, not a candidate, the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, have said, look, we have things to do in Congress. We need to show the people of the United States of America that we are here for their needs, and that the real referendum on what Donald Trump has done, whether or not it's a crime, it is still 10 episodes of possible obstruction of justice, which tells us something about his character and something about how he views his own role in office, that the ballot box is the remedy.
You know, the violation of norms, Rebecca, that you were talking about are something that Trump supporters know about and they accept, and something the Dems recognize is not going to go away as well. Don't you ladies both think that Mueller testifying is perhaps the next most significant moment?
Yes, and I would have much rather seen, if there was ever to be a press conference, which I think there shouldn't have been at all, that the press conference was conducted by Robert Mueller.
Right. So we're coming up on the top of the hour, 11:01 Eastern Time, and we still don't have a report. But the Congress doesn't have it either. We do have somebody else we'd like to bring into the conversation.
Yeah, no, we got to wait for. She's got to. We're using the magic of TV to
right,
get her
she's coming on in. Right. We're going to take a break.
We're going to be talking. So what we're looking at right there is the White House. The president is expected to speak in front of a group of wounded warriors. Of course, this was a pre-planned event. He probably has prepared remarks, but as the president is prone to do, at times he departs from those remarks. So we're going to be watching this very, very closely to see if he has any comments to make at all. He's been very outspoken about the Mueller report throughout this whole thing. And so here's what's happened this morning. The AG, Will Barr, had a press conference this morning, and essentially, David, he sort of elaborated on his 4-page summary. And gave us a little more insight into how he was thinking. The bottom line is, though, no collusion, no obstruction.
It was his 4-page summary in person, right, where you could hear his tone and his inflection, and that's where at times he seemed to be not only the Attorney General but the spokesperson for the president. What I highlighted in my notes was when he said there was no evidence of Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government hacking. Now, we do know there will be 10 sections, right, that will be addressed in the 400-page Mueller report. Those 10 sections may have some pretty embarrassing information that the Democrats and others may use to shame the president.
10 incidents as they relate to obstruction of justice. And so some of the answers that we didn't get from William Barr was about this obstruction of justice, about the fact that, according to him, the Mueller report sort of left it up in the air, and he came to a conclusion. Is that what Robert Mueller wanted, or did he want that to be passed on to Congress? He sort of danced around that answer. And also there's some questions as to, obstruction needs intent. And the president did not sit down to be interviewed, though he did write written responses. And based on William Barr's sort of statement, he kind of projected intent into the president. He says there was ample evidence, so maybe I shouldn't say that. He says there was ample evidence up to the president's intent, that he was frustrated, and perhaps that's part of the reason that he may have done things that could appear to be obstruction of justice. We don't know. We got to see the report.
And Mr. Barr also said that Special Counsel Mueller did not believe there was enough evidence to bring forward a crime as well. So both men, both Mr. Mueller and Mr. Barr, do not believe there's enough for a crime. Molly Hooper joins us now on set. She's a CBSN political contributor and Capitol Hill reporter. All right, I know you've probably been chomping at the bit after watching it. What's your bulletin banner?
My bulletin banner is that actually David Cicilline, who is a member of the Judiciary Committee, has blocked off 3 hours today. No phones, no Twitter, nothing, and he's actually going to read the report. Okay. Congress is actually going to read what they receive, and that's actually pretty big for members of Congress.
Absolutely, and we're going to read it too.
We're going to read it too. But the big banner is you have Republicans coming out saying no obstruction, no collusion. They're sort of victorious. I don't see many of the Game of Thrones-esque type tweets from members of Congress, but
let me just pause you for a moment. The report is out. The report is out. So, Control Room, can you tell me, is the report out on the DOJ website? All right, so what's going to happen is, as we're speaking live, our news team in the Hub is trying to figure out how to get the digital version of that report so we can print it out. I'm being told right now in my ears, I talk to you, cbsnews.com/Mueller is what you can go to right now, and you can read the report for yourself. What we're going to do...
Is it up now? Okay.
It is up. cbsnews.com/Mueller. We're going to get a copy of the report, and what we want to do, this is the great thing about CBSN, we get all day to do it. We can go through the report and read sections. We have these wonderful analysts who are all here, Ricky Kleeman, Rebecca...
Right.
I never want to get the name wrong. And Molly Hooper. I always say people deserve to have their name pronounced properly. You can at least do that. So, again, the report is out if you want to go and read it at 11:06 a.m. Eastern. We are still waiting for the president to take the podium at the White House. There's a Wounded Warriors event. He has not gotten there yet, but I'm assuming he's going to talk about
Everyone's looking in one direction.
He did tweet, though. I don't know if you saw it. He tweeted, "Game over." Oh, we have a network special report, so we'll send you over to that. Stand by. Here we go.